The story of Eve Carson begins in the early hours of March 5, 2008, when her lifeless body was discovered in the middle of an intersection, lying in a pool of blood. Her family was shocked and confused, as Eve had no known enemies and was known to be a kind soul with many friends. It seemed senseless and cruel that anyone would want to harm her. This is the tragic and disturbing account of Eve Carson's life and death, and the pursuit of justice for her killers. Eve Carson was born in Athens, Georgia in 1985 to parents Teresa and Bob Carson. Along with her brother Andrew, she grew up in a close-knit and loving family. Despite being a top-performing student and achieving many academic honors, Eve was also committed to volunteering and helping others. She was president of her high school's student body, a peer educator at a safe house for troubled teens, and a page in the U.S. House of Representatives. She was also a recipient of the Moorhead King Scholarship and a double major in political science and biology at the University of North Carolina, UNC, where she was a member of the Pi Beta Kappa Honor Society. Despite her many accomplishments, Eve remained dedicated to serving others and spent her summers volunteering in countries such as Ecuador, Egypt, and Ghana. Her family believed she was safe living in the small and low-crime town of Chapel Hill, home to UNC and a community of young people. However, tragedy struck when Eve's lifeless body was found and her family was left to grapple with the senseless loss of their beloved daughter and sister. In the early hours of March 5, 2008, just before sunrise, Eve's neighbors in Hillcrest Circle were disturbed by a loud noise, and one of them decided to call the police. A woman reported hearing a gunshot, followed by a woman screaming, and then 3 more gunshots. Despite being barely awake, she wondered if what she heard was real. Soon after, someone else called 911. The police arrived at the scene within minutes and were shocked to discover the lifeless body of a young woman lying in a pool of blood at the intersection of Hillcrest Road and Hillcrest Circle. Eve had been shot multiple times at close range with a handgun and had no chance to defend herself. At the time, the police had no information about Eve's identity or how she had died, except that she was a woman in her early 20s who had been found dead at the scene. The true and darker details of her final moments remained unknown to them. On the morning of March 5th, Eve's housemates became worried when they realized that she had not returned home the night before. This was unusual for Eve, as she was not the type to attend overnight parties or stay at unfamiliar places without informing her housemates beforehand. They contacted the university to inquire if Eve had made it there, but the staff at the university had not seen her. This raised concerns. Unfortunately, when the housemates reached out to the police, they were asked to come to the station to identify a body. It was Eve. Everyone who knew her was devastated by the news. Her family was especially heartbroken that they did not get the chance to say goodbye to their only daughter. The police could not fathom a motive for the murder, as Eve was a well-liked student with no known enemies. The fact that she was killed in the middle of an intersection close to a major university campus left the community frightened and perplexed. There were no clues at the crime scene, and the possibility of a serial killer or a robbery murder was raised. At the time, all the police could do was establish a detailed chronology of the events leading up to Eve's murder. The last known sighting of her was on March 5th at approximately 1:30 a.m., when her housemates left the house to grab a drink and she stayed behind to study. However, no one knew what Eve did between 1:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. that morning, except that she did not sleep. The following day, the police found Eve's Toyota Highlander parked a few minutes away from where her body was discovered. As days went by, news reports continued to highlight the absence of any viable suspects or evidence, indicating that whoever killed Eve had covered their tracks with remarkable efficiency. The police were in dire need of public assistance in solving this case. Upon analyzing Eve's computer, the police concluded that she had last accessed it shortly after 3:30 a.m., which suggested that she was at home that night and was awake. This also implied that she had been abducted between that time and 5 a.m. Additionally, the police found evidence that someone had made several attempts to withdraw cash from Eve's bank account at 3:55 a.m., although it was evident that it was not Eve who attempted the withdrawals, as she would have known her PIN. Further investigations led the police to an ATM located at the University Mall near the crime scene, where $700 was withdrawn using Eve's card. The police also discovered more activity on a drive-through ATM belonging to the Bank of America. Finally, the police obtained a picture of a man driving Eve's SUV and withdrawing money from the ATM. The man was wearing a hoodie and a cap, apparently attempting to conceal his identity as much as possible. After discovering the suspect's use of Eve's credit card, the Chapel Hill police were able to identify two individuals in grainy images captured on CCTV footage. Interestingly, one of the images appeared to show a second person in the back seat of Eve's car. The suspects continued to use Eve's card around town the following day, providing crucial leads for the investigation. The police tracked the card's usage to Moorhead Avenue Mini Mart in Durham, and then to Carolina Food Mart, which had security cameras inside. These cameras captured footage of the second suspect, but it was an anonymous tip that ultimately led to the identification of Demario James Atwater. Unfortunately, Demario had a lengthy criminal history that included charges for drug possession with intent to sell, trespassing, robbery, and burglary. He had even been found guilty of possessing a firearm while on probation in 2006. On February 20, 2008, Demario James Atwater was arrested for violating his probation by carrying a firearm. Despite being released on a $10,000 bond, he failed to appear in court on March 3rd, and 2 days later, he killed Eve, who was just 21 at the time. Demario had numerous opportunities to turn his life around, but he chose a life of crime instead. The police managed to identify him as one of the suspects and traced his address to Durham, which is not far from Eve's home in Chapel Hill. During the investigation, the police also discovered the identity of the other suspect, Alvin Lawrence Levet, who was a high school dropout from Durham with an extensive criminal record. Lawrence had already been convicted of multiple crimes, including narcotics possession, larceny, breaking and entering, and felony possession of a firearm. Despite being on probation for breaking into a house in March 2008, Lawrence continued to commit crimes. On March 12, 2008, Demario's arrest was widely reported in North Carolina. By the end of March, both Lawrence and Demario were indicted on first-degree murder charges. In July, they faced additional charges of kidnapping, robbery with a dangerous weapon, larceny, possession of a firearm by a felon, and possession of stolen goods, including Eve's Toyota. The case became even more disturbing as more details emerged. During the investigation of Lawrence's case, the authorities uncovered his involvement in the murder of Abiji Mahato, a 29-year-old engineering student. It's hard to imagine being a teenage serial killer, but Lawrence had committed multiple murders before he even turned 18. At his trial, he faced charges for both murders, but the evidence wasn't enough to convict him of Abiji's murder, and he was eventually acquitted. The trial for both murders lasted 2 years, during which the prosecution presented a harrowing account of the events that took place the night of Eve's murder. At 3:30 a.m. on March 5th, a student who was sitting in her car on Friendly Lane, where Eve also lived, noticed two men staring at her. She drove off in fear, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw the men approach Eve's house. Lawrence and DeMario chose Eve as their victim because she was an easy target, home alone, and awake at a time when most people were not on the streets to report a crime. The two men broke into Eve's home and forced her at gunpoint into the back seat of her SUV. They then attempted to withdraw all her money from various ATMs, and Eve gave them her PIN. However, after they withdrew $700, they reached the daily limit, and their attempts to withdraw more caused the account to be blocked. Angry and frustrated, they drove to an intersection where they decided to kill her because she had seen their faces and they feared she would report them if they let her live. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Lawrence dared to claim in court that nobody's perfect and that he was not the monster the prosecution had portrayed him to be. He pleaded not guilty and demanded a retrial because he had received a life sentence while he was still under 18. However, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the second time, and he got what he deserved. DeMario, however, was found guilty of all charges but managed to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment just before he offered a lengthy apology. But can any apology ever truly make up for the senseless murder of a young woman for a mere $700? Eve's tragic death not only robbed her of a promising life, but also highlights the failures of the justice system. It is striking to note that both killers were on probation when they committed the murder. Despite numerous chances to turn their lives around, they failed to do so. The justice system gave them repeated opportunities to reform, but they continued down a path of crime until they committed the ultimate atrocity. Alright guys, what do you think about this case? Could Eve's murder have been prevented, and how? Let me know down in the comments section, and before you go, don't forget to give a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more.